And today I'm just going to be running through the difference between a legal boat and an offshore-ready boat. So the background of this is we've got a checklist that we use where we create a simple kind of summary of some of the leading organisations around the world and what they recommend, so that if you're not taking part in a race or a formal rally where they require you to carry things, that you can also just kind of cross-reference and decide for yourself if there's other things that might be useful for you from an equipment and of course a training perspective. And we've been maintaining this resource in different formats for a very long time now, probably about 15 years. And we recently also added looking at the ARC, or the World ARC, which is one of the leading rallies for cruisers. And as part of that, we also included the updated Maritime New Zealand, which has a Category 1 for all recreational vessels that has to be signed off to be given permission essentially to leave New Zealand by boat. And then also the Australian Sailing and Rourke requirements, who run many offshore races, including some of the most highly regarded ones in the world, such as the Rolex Sydney to Hobart and the Fastnet race. One of the things that causes you to need to look at this all the time is, of course, there will be incidents that prompt different recommendations due to gear failure or things that with hindsight become foreseeable. But the other thing is, of course, technology leaps forward. So especially when you have things like the AIS beacons or the satellite communications, and so that's areas where we find that the checklists are constantly kind of updating and evolving. Or you might have different features of life jackets, such as spray hoods and things that get added on. And often, especially when you look at a racing perspective as a bit of background, so the sort of governing body globally, World Sailing, has their own special regulations, which you are able to reference yourself. But then in different countries, these special regulations or special regs then get adapted by Australian Sailing or the Royal Ocean Racing Club or whoever, just to make sure that they're also appropriate to the races that they're running and the environment that they happen to be in terms of temperature, standard weather patterns, etc. And so it's useful sometimes just to see in different places, okay, well, this has become a big focus in Australia, maybe this has become a big focus in Europe and the Caribbean, and then we can kind of go on from there. One of the things I always want to see is, first of all, of course, what do the organisations actually always agree on? Are there any themes that appear repeatedly? But also, for recreational boaters, what can we just learn from this and go, oh, okay, this wasn't mentioned on my state maritime requirement in WA or Queensland or New South Wales or Tas or whatever it might be, but actually having a look now, maybe carrying a sharp knife might be a really good idea. Often there are things that you'll get everywhere, like flares and things, of course life jackets, but the level of detail will often vary, and so in some places it might just say everyone has to have a life jacket, and somewhere else it might say everyone has to have a life jacket, but they also have to have a spray hood, it has to have retroreflective tape, it has to have an automatic light, a crotch strap, possibly a beacon, maybe a harness point. So sometimes, although you might say everyone says yes, we need a life jacket, the detail can then evolve, and from that, even when the life jackets are worn and so on. The other area of interest, which often doesn't get covered when you just look at things like sort of base recreational boating rules, is the actual competency. So, things like man overboard drills, sea survival training, first aid training, crew briefings and inductions, and of course the emergency procedures, so having them and practicing them. In terms of the recovery capability, so it's not just the preventing of the person falling overboard, it's actually physically looking at how do we recover someone if they fall in the water? What would we do if they're conscious and able to assist? What do we do if they're unconscious or conscious but unable to assist? And have we actually practiced our systems and broken these things down? Of course, we've many podcasts and content, some blogs that we've made over the years about different elements of man overboard, but the key detail really is, have you actually practiced with the equipment that you've got to make sure that you and the people on board could use it if needed, and do we also understand how the equipment that's meant to keep people on board works? So for example, using tethers at the appropriate length for clipping onto the right places, that kind of stuff, using tethers at all, of course. Then there's the redundancy. That's probably one of the strongest focuses other than training that you see consistently across everywhere. So things like the fixed VHF radio, of course these days making sure it's got the capability of digital selective cooling and that has been programmed with an MMSI, the handheld VHF, and you're starting to see, rather than specifically requiring, often it's just recommended at this stage, but that if possible that the handheld VHF has the SC capabilities. That was particularly clear in the ARC, the Atlantic Rally for Cruisers, and World Rally recommendations. The satellite communication, so as people have been becoming less and less reliant just on the long range, MFHF or SSB radios for their weather and communications. A lot of vessels, saw a huge percentage of people in the most recent ARC set off with some form of Starlink or an equivalent, but also something about 80% roughly of those people also reported that they had taken a backup communication. So maybe they were predominantly using Starlink, but then they had something like an Iridium just as a backup, or a Garmin spot, or something that was just a simple messaging service that they could use via satellite if needed, as well as their sort of standard radio communications. AIS is pretty consistent everywhere. There's no surprises there. That's been around for a long time. And the key is really, if one system goes down, what do we do next? And so it's like, okay, well, if we can't, for example, I've always thought it was funny when someone once pointed out to me, one of the reasons I carry my Iridium is because if my Starlink fails, I still need to be able to get online and try and problem solve what's caused that to fail, so I need a backup system for that. And there's obviously lots of wider uses and thoughts and considerations, but basically the redundancy, if my plan A doesn't work, do I have a plan B, and have I tested it? The other thing is some of the gaps. So you start, when you look, for example, in Australia, there's a lot of state requirements which are a legal minimum. They're often, unapologetically were not designed for the 0.001% of people who might be heading hundreds or thousands of miles offshore. They're mainly written for the recreational boaters that are heading out, having a day's fishing, or a short sail in the harbour, that kind of stuff. So just because there's a legal minimum there, which of course if you're sailing into somewhere or transiting somewhere, then you need to make sure you comply with that minimum. But often there is an opportunity to go beyond, and the minimum is a good starting point, but that's why we're looking at these things. And stuff like the detail I was mentioning, you could maintain the legal minimum requirement just with some cheap $5 foam life jackets with no lights, no crotch straps, that you feasibly going to struggle to wear and probably would not fit most people in anger, but that might meet your legal minimum requirement, but might not be that practical for offshore passages over multi-day adventures. The other thing then, so outside of the legal minimums, is of course stuff like the training, recovery, comms, and then your own self-sufficiency, so be it tools, spares, skills, etc. One of the things for me, I'm preparing my own boat, particularly is the recovery capability. So it can be a default when you do what I do for a living. Oh, that's cool, Neil's here, he can handle that. But of course, I'm as capable of falling overboard and getting injured as everybody else, if not more at times. So therefore, it's a good idea, I find, to make sure that I've set things up so that people can do things if I'm out of the picture. With the communications redundancy, that might just be simple things like, have I got someone else to do a radio check? Does anyone else here know how to report our position? Am I getting other people to fill out a logbook so they know where we are and how to get that information, how to record it if they're the one listening to an incident on the radio while I'm looking after things on deck? The crew training and drills, little and often, is always my favourite there, so all that sort of stuff comes through. And of course, particularly the focus on things like the emergency steering comes up a lot on these bigger trips. So, rather than just going, oh yeah, we've got an emergency tiller or a drogue or something tucked somewhere, like, have you used it? And especially in the Royal Ocean Racing Club, a lot of their stuff comes in saying around a functionality. So I have tested this, I have used this, our crew are aware of how this works and have tried it recently, that kind of stuff. And so especially things like emergency steering, it's a great one to figure out when you still have the option of a rudder, if necessary, to actually steer the boat, as well as just using it from a safety perspective. So the biggest lessons we took out of this update, which you are very welcome to review for yourself. We've got it there free to download within Logbook. If you haven't got a free account for that already, you literally just set it up with a name and an email address, and then you can use all of the skills and vessels assessment there and download a copy of this list for yourself. But equipment was definitely not the biggest lesson. It was preparation, planning, training, recovery capability, crew competency, and they were consistent across all of the kind of key leading recreational boating bodies of Maritime, New Zealand, Australian Sailing, the Royal Ocean Racing Club, and the ARC. So look, thanks very much. I hope this was helpful. Please jump into Logbook and check it out. And that was it. Bye.